Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this evening. It's nice to see a lot of familiar names and faces, and just as much a lot of unfamiliar names and faces. Um, this is this is a good thing. We're getting a lot of good turnout lately in these digital events. Um, okay, so my name is Jakob Mueller. I'm currently the president of the OFNC. One of my um, uh, personal special interests is herpetology, reptiles and amphibians, and I do particularly like the snakes in that group. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about the snakes that we have in our area, and I will let you know what we've got here and why the relatively small number of species that we have are actually quite important locally and quite interesting and worth appreciating. So let me just share my presentation and here we go. Okay, so Snakes of the Ottawa District is the title. And the reason for the specificity of that title is because 40 years ago, 40 years ago now, Dr. Francis Cook published an article in Trail and Landscape. So in 1981, it was the reptiles and amphibians of the Ottawa District. This is it, or amphibians and reptiles, other way around. It was a summary of all of the reptile and amphibian species found inside the Ottawa, basically it's the bird count circle. It's a 50-kilometer radius from originating from the Peace Tower, which is sort of formally defined as the Ottawa district for the OFNC. That definition was set up a very long time ago, before any of the current municipal boundaries were established as they are today. And it also, just like those county boundaries, sort of ignores, natural geology and formations and habitats. It's just a circle. And the idea back in the 19th century, when this was established, when it was 30 miles, not 50 kilometers, was that it was as far as you could really travel and explore in a day and get back to the city. And then when we went metric in 1976, we added a small amount to it, because 30 miles is actually 48 kilometers. But since that sounds weird, we rounded up to 50. Anyway, this article was written by this man, Dr. Francis Cook. He was curator emeritus at the Canadian Museum of Nature. He was the head of the herpetology section for his career there. And he was basically one of the authorities on herpetology in Canada. And he unfortunately died last year. Here's an older photo of Dr. Cook holding one of the live specimens of the museum. That's a fox snake, which is not one of our locals, but I like this photo. So his article back in 1981 was illustrated by Charles Douglas, and it had this plate of illustrations for the snakes. He later ended up publishing a book on the Introduction to Canadian Amphibians and Reptiles in 1984, a few years later, which used similar or some of the same illustrations. And it was kind of a go-to guide for quite some time before there were better ones available with local context, or at least Canadian context. There's some limitations here. These are all species we're going to talk about tonight, but there's no reference scale or proportion here, and the head shapes are a little bit off for a couple of those. Milk snakes looking a little hog-nosy. And also there's a lizard on this page for the only reason that it's there is to discuss that it's not in the area, but it's found in Lanark County and west. The most interesting feature of the article were these range maps. There's one of these for every species, and they're dot distribution maps, and they're basically based almost exclusively on specimen records. So a bottled animal that's somewhere in the collection of the Museum of Nature or maybe another museum. For a long time, our understanding of distributions was limited to these sorts of collections. Of course, today, photographic vouchers with digital cameras are a lot easier to do, and we don't need physical specimens for a lot of animals, at least a lot of vertebrates. So we can fill in a lot of these gaps, and I'll touch on that as we go on. But this kind of data is very valuable, because when you're trying to determine where an animal lives, you can plot the data this way, or you can use those range maps that you often see in field guides with these big sweeping filled in colored sections, but those lack a lot of nuance, and they make a lot of assumptions, because obviously we may or may not have data. So for example, this map on the right is the northern red-bellied snake. This area here, there are no dots. Is that because it's absent? Or is that because we don't have data? It's one of the things we'll talk about, but on a larger scale map that's just sort of filled in the range, that would probably just be painted in, regardless of whether or not it's a true absence. Anyway, let's back that up and start at the beginning, I guess. Beginning usually being the best place to start. What are snakes? Well, they're reptiles. They're in an order of reptiles called Squamata. And I see that I've forgotten to fill in the suborder on my slide. It's Serpentes, but basically serpents with an ES instead of an S. The other suborder, another major suborder in Squamata is the lizards. Reptiles are actually a pretty diverse collection of loosely related vertebrates. They're not that closely related, or I should say snakes and lizards have some distance between them. There are differences between them. And as a group, they are not that closely related to turtles or to crocodiles, but they're all considered reptiles. And basically, they're the leftovers of biology. Back when our sort of taxonomic order was being established, Carl Linnaeus, who gave us our binomial naming system, personally disliked snakes and other reptiles and amphibians quite a bit. And he did not care for them. So they were really the leftover species, and they didn't get as good a treatment as some of the other species where taxonomies have changed maybe less over time. Originally, there were like two genuses of snakes, and that's had to be corrected. Oh my goodness, I didn't finish the slide. Not only did I not tell you the suborder, I was supposed to fill in that there's about 3,500 species of snakes in the world, and that number is going to vary based on taxonomic classification and the fact that we probably haven't described all of the species yet. We may not even know about all of them. However, there are 16 species that are native to the province of Ontario. One of them is extirpated. There's 15 left, and there's 7 or 8 in the Ottawa district, and obviously I'll talk about why that's an or. Now, snakes are ectothermic. This is an important consideration. We don't see them now in the wintertime when there's accumulating snow outside. Ectothermic is what we used to call cold-blooded, but it's the term is fallen into disuse, partly because when you call someone or something cold-blooded, it sounds like you're calling it, bloodthirsty or cruel, and that's not really fair or accurate here. And it's also not technically correct, because on a hot summer day, the blood inside a reptile, or an amphibian for that matter, could be warmer than your own. The optimal temperature range for the smooth green snake is apparently closer to 40 degrees. At that temperature, internally, we would be very ill, but that snake tends to thrive. And most importantly here, the snakes are subject to a lot of fear and and derision and hatred, and it's entirely unwarranted. They're important parts of the ecosystem. Their prey is significant, and they're significant as a food source. So, they need to be there in the ecosystem to balance or limit the numbers of whatever it is that the individual species eats, be it frogs or worms or slugs or rodents. But at the same time, snakes are food for all sorts of other predators like hawks, owls, fishers, foxes, coyotes. All sorts of things will prey on snakes, and it's another food source. So this snake here is not something we're going to talk about this evening. This is the Massasauga rattlesnake. It is the only venomous snake in the province of Ontario. And the reason I'm showing you the Massasauga rattlesnake is because it's not here. Get a lot of questions about this from people who don't know much about snakes and who are maybe afraid of snakes. This is the Ontario Reptile and Amphibian Atlas map of the known range of the Massasauga today. You can see there's two major populations, one on the shore of Georgian Bay, very far away, one on the Bruce Peninsula, very far away, and there's two tiny declining remnant populations in southwestern Ontario. All those red dots are historic records. There are some other historic records that couldn't be mapped because of the vagueness of the descriptions. There's two populations in New York, one near Rochester, one near Syracuse, and a lot of historic anecdotal records from North Shore Lake Ontario. So it may have been in that lower Lake Ontario basin at one time, but it was never near Ottawa. It is not in Ottawa. So if you see a snake and you're in the Ottawa district, it's not venomous, which is not to say that it's necessarily, what am I trying to say? It's not to say that the Massasauga is something to be feared or that it's dangerous, but that, because it isn't really, but if venom is something that is a driving factor in any fear or apprehension you have, you don't have to worry about it in our area. Now, before we move on to the species, I want to give everyone one crash course, one thing in snake identification. There's one lesson I like to teach anybody about identifying a snake, it's this: smooth scales and keeled scales. There's basically two types of scales that any type of snake will have, or any species of snake, or rather, any one species of snake won't have both, it'll have one or the other. And of course, it's nature. There's some funny exceptions and some in-between things, but nothing to worry about here. If you're trying to identify a snake, start with this. Does it have smooth scales or keeled scales? If you can answer that question, most of the misidentifications that happen in this part of the world can be solved by that alone. So what we're talking about here is, if you look at the scales where my mouse is, these are flat. On this particular species, they're actually glossy and iridescent, but they're flat, just plain. Whereas on this one over here, you can see in the middle of each scale, there's that little ridge, that little raised area. This snake over here with the smooth scales looks smooth. And this one on the right with the keeled scales looks rough. So even if you aren't close enough to see the keel, you can actually ascertain the type of scale fairly easily because it's smooth or rough looking. And then if you look a little closer, you'll be saying, oh, that's why it looks rough. It's because it has these keeled scales, or, oh, it looks so glossy because it has smooth scales. Really, the number one thing to take away, to look at before even looking at pattern and color. Now, let's move on to the species that are found in our area. I'm going to talk about 8 species. 7 are definitely found in the Ottawa district, and the 8, we'll see, we'll get to it. Okay, so the first one we should talk about is the very first photo you saw when I started the presentation. It's the eastern garter snake. guess before we get into this, if you're familiar with scientific names, all species, they have a genus, which groups them with like or closely related species, and a species name, which is unique within that genus. A lot of reptiles and amphibians, you'll actually see a trinomial name, as in here, where we've repeated the word Sertalis, because a lot of reptiles and amphibians have subspecies. There's a lot of wide-ranging species with geographically distinct but regionally discrete populations. So basically, in one area, the species looks one way, and in another area, the species looks another way. And in order to distinguish those in a formal way, they're assigned a subspecies. Sometimes the validity of these it gets challenged, and there's some debate around this, but they're a pretty functional way. When you have a single species, that it's definitely a species that inhabits an area, and it's not reproductively isolated from its subspecies. It allows you to sort of distinguish which form. So the subspecies that we have of the common garter snake, which is Thamnophis sertalis, is the eastern garter snake, the nominate subspecies, because it's the same as the species name again. That's why it's repeated. So anyway, that's your Latin lesson, I guess, of the day. The Latin name Thamnophis means shrub snake or bush snake, and sertalis means like a rope or like a string. They're named garters, named after a rope or a string that men used to use to tie up their socks, or garters, around the time when the snake was first described. It was brought back to Sweden by Peter Kalm, sort of a acolyte of Linnaeus, and it was collected near Niagara Falls, Ontario. So that's why the eastern garter snake, the nominate subspecies, was the first collected of the whole species. Anyway, it might be too deep into the weeds for some of you. Let's talk about the actual snake. It is the most common snake that any one of us will see in our area. It's probably familiar to everybody. If you go out for a hike and you've seen a snake, this is probably the snake that you've seen. It's widespread. Any decent green space in our area will have this species, and any number of less than decent green spaces still have them too. The average size of an adult is a little over a foot to a little over 2. The males are smaller than the females. In unusual circumstances, or maybe not unusual, but uncommon circumstances, they can actually be over 1 meter in length. That's not common. They usually, for one reason or another, they usually die before they get that big. But it can happen that there are very big garter snakes. They eat just about anything that they can catch. They don't do anything special to their prey. They just sort of grab it and swallow it. And most garter snakes have a distinct preference for earthworms, but they eat slugs, small frogs, fish if they can catch them, salamanders if they find them. And some of those large adults are able to eat mice and other similar rodents like voles and shrews. They're a habitat generalist, which is one of the reasons why they're so common today in our sort of disturbed and fragmented and urbanized landscape, because whatever's left, they can adapt to it. They are more common near water, but that's because there's more food for them near water, because obviously most animals like access to water, and they do eat things like, again, frogs and fish, which live in and around water. And the ID for these is pretty, well, I want to say it's simple, but it isn't. This is a typical adult in the springtime. They have a dark body with yellow stripes. Okay. You see the side stripe there can be quite broad, and the yellow can go down to the belly. Sometimes there's that checkering underneath right here. You have a dorsal stripe or a stripe down the center. It's usually the yellowish color like this. This is the same day as the last picture. This is a mating bowl. There's actually 7 snakes in the vicinity of my camera at this point. You can see 3 in the image. Basically, there's 6 males and 1 female, and right after they wake up for the spring, this is what happens with snakes. They have a little party. This is also a typical appearance, but different than the ones on the previous images. This one has more pronounced checkering, and this is pretty common or frequent, where the sides in between the stripes have these alternating black checkers and some sort of stitching that's visible. Now this snake is striking a defensive posture. It's turning to face me. It's flattening its head and its neck. And sometimes the snakes will flatten out to make themselves look bigger and more threatening to deter me, the predator, from eating them. And sometimes when they do that flattening out, the checkers become more pronounced or visible. But some snakes, they're visible all the time, regardless. Like this little one. I lifted up a rock, and this little young garter snake was there, and it's not really flattened out that much, and it's got a lot of checkering that you can see. Now, these are typical ones. And now I'm going to tell you why it's not so straightforward, because they can be some different colors sometimes. I'm not sure how well this one comes through. This snake's blue. You look at the top of the head and the side here, all of the color on this that would normally be yellow or whitish was blue or bluish. And that's it's not common, but it is something that happens with some frequency in the species. And this was near Perth. This is a very brown one. It's got a reduced dorsal stripe, no real dark coloration at all. It's got, the checkers are very visible, but the ground color is this olive tan or brown color. And this color form in the subspecies is actually quite common on the Lake Erie Islands and around the western and southern end of Lake Erie, where this photo was taken. And they can be very, very colorful. This is sort of like a highly decorated version of that brown one. And it in person was absolutely stunning. You can see there's stitching in light orange and dark red and this bluish tinge to the stripes and the olive, and it looks like someone has crafted a bracelet. It's certainly an atypical but very beautiful bird. So it's a very polymorphic subspecies. There's a lot of valid color forms that it's not like a weird genetic anomaly or anything like that. It's just one of the many appearances that it has across its range. There's some near Montreal that are, instead of yellow, they have bright orange sides, and near Kingston you can get, and near Lake Erie as well, you can get some where the lateral stripes are orange or peach or red instead of yellow, but they otherwise look normal. This one's showing a bit of that. The lateral stripe there has a bit of red color. If that red took over, that in some areas would be normal. But mostly in the Ottawa district, we have the more typical forms, this and the checkered one. Now, the cloudy eye here, I wanted to throw this in too. This is something you'll see from time to time with snakes. If they look physically fine, but they have this cloudy eye, they're fine. This is something they go through called ecdysis. It means they're going to shed their skin. So what happens is we and a lot of animals, we shed our skin in little pieces. Our skin comes off and we don't really notice, and it makes dust in our houses. And a snake, though, it has to shed its skin in one piece. It's a single event that happens periodically, more often when it's growing, but at least a couple times a year for any adult as well. And when that happens, they need to go somewhere dark and warm and moist. So often, if you look under objects, rocks or boards or things where snakes hide, a lot of those snakes will be in this state because they're trying to stay sheltered from predators, but be warm and be in a place that's got a moist microclimate, just to help them loosen up that old skin. And then they literally rub their nose on something, break it open, and they crawl out of it as it turns inside out. which sounds weird, but you find the skins from time to time. So that's what's going on there. Now, this is Dr. Cook's original map from the 1981 article. This is the dot distribution of garter snake specimens in the Ottawa district. Now, I updated that with other vouchered records that we've accumulated in the last 40 years, and it looks like this now. So we filled in some gaps, not really a surprise, fully expected to be throughout the region, but you know, surprisingly large areas here where there weren't any records, especially east of Ottawa, which is a pattern we see with a lot of these species. Now, instead of going to the next most easy or common species, I got to throw a curveball here. The northern ribbon snake is one of the rarest snakes in the district, but it's a very close relative of the garter snake. And the fact that it's easily confused with the garter snake might be one of the reasons why we think it's so rare. It's only really known from the area around the Morris Island Conservation Area, almost in Arnprior. It was discovered there originally in 1978 and 79. Some people doing some survey work related to the dam that's there wrote an article noting that they'd found, you know, a large and healthy population of ribbon snakes in wetlands in that area. That was published in a Trail and Landscape. And since that time, nobody had seen any until very recently. But their average size is similar to the smaller garters. They don't get as big typically. Side by side, two garters that are a garter and a ribbon that are the same length. The ribbon will look more slender, most likely, and will have a proportionally longer tail. Believe it or not, not all of the snake is tail, only part of the back end. Now, the difference here is the ribbon snake isn't a generalist in habitat or diet. It's a specialist. It needs high quality wetlands, and it only really eats small fish and small frogs that it catches in those wetlands. So it likes the edges of ponds, marshes, wet meadows, grassy or mossy sort of flat areas near wetlands are particularly good for it. And it'll hibernate away from water. So occasionally it can be found away from water, but typically you have to be in these habitats to see it. And typically these habitats, you know, they're wet, they're goopy. They're not really the kind of place where people go walking. That's one reason why we won't see them. And the other reason is when we see them, whoever it is may not realize that it's not just a regular garter snake. Unlike the garter, oh, right. So David Seaburn, he's a herpetologist currently working with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. He found this while doing a survey. This is an unfortunately dead ribbon snake at Morris Island, and this record from 2019 was the first time that had been like properly documented with the vouchered record since 1979. And since then, it's been seen a couple of times. So it is still in that area for sure. Now, here's a ribbon snake. I was trying to say, I got myself out of order on my own slides. Hey, the stripes, first of all, they're more crisp. Somebody I know likes to say that the garter snake is low res and the ribbon snake is high definition. If you look at a garter snake stripe, I can even go back here a little. You look at the edges of the dorsal stripe, they're kind of rough. They're uneven a little bit. Whereas if we look at the ribbon snake stripe, it's very crisp and clean and flat. That's not the only way, obviously, to tell. There's some other things here. Ribbon snakes don't have as variable appearance. They look like this. They're not going to be blue. They're not going to be brown. They're not going to be checkered. If it's checkered, it's not this. But they have this crisp stripe, and it's higher up on the side. And there's scales here. If you count the scales up from the belly, you see 1, 2, 3, 4. rows of scales. On the garter snake, this lateral stripe is on officially rows 2 and 3. Often it bleeds down into 1 and into the belly, and you don't have this brown here. On the ribbon snake, it's up on rows 3 and 4, and this chocolate brown stripe is very consistently under it and very visible once you get used to recognizing these. They also have a white chin, not the same color as their lateral stripe. It's noticeably white, and this little crescent in front of the eye at the right angle is easy to see. So if you get a side shot of a garter snake or a ribbon snake and you're not sure what it is, a picture from this angle can be definitive if you have the head in it. You know, it can even be if you just see one moving through the leaves of the grass, right there. We can see the chocolate brown stripe. We can see the little crescent and the white chin. They are different, but once you have sort of a familiarity, they're easier to see. So I'm very used to seeing a lot of snakes, and I've seen a lot of ribbon and garter snakes. At this point, I recognize right away which one it is. But before you get there, when you're learning what they are, it can be a bit challenging. So here's the map of the ribbon snake from the 1981 article, and here's the map today. Didn't change that much. Now, the red dot on the Quebec side of the river there is a new record, and that makes sense. It's the same area. And in fact, on the north side of the Ottawa River, from about that point to about whatever is opposite Pembroke, that's the only area in the province of Quebec where this species has ever been found. It gets very close to the border in some other places, but doesn't enter the province of Quebec except for there. Now, the two blue dots you see, one is a recent report and one is a older report in the Ontario Reptile and Amphibian Atlas. I haven't been able to review those records myself. They're presumably valid if they're validated in there, but it's possible that the species is actually found in other areas, in other wetlands, and for the reasons I've mentioned, that it's not, that's just not being distinguished from the garter snake. So it's a good one to keep an eye out for. So moving back into snakes you're more likely to actually see, the northern red-bellied snake is like the second most common snake in the Ottawa district. It's widespread, but it's locally common. So there'll be spots where you can actually find quite a few of them, and there'll be spots that will seem almost the same in terms of habitat, but where you never see them. And that's sort of true in a lot of parts of the range for this species, and I have never seen or read any reason for that. But because they're very small and a little bit secretive and nocturnal at certain times of the year, they don't get seen as much as garters, and they're also not as bright or conspicuous if they do happen to be out at the same time as the humans. They're, if not the smallest snake in Canada, the second smallest. I'm not sure how they measure up with the sharp-tailed snake in BC, but they're very small. A foot-long adult is a big snake for a red belly. But if you are lucky enough to have these around your property or in your garden, it can be very beneficial. They really, really like eating slugs, which for gardeners can be very helpful. They'll eat other soft-bodied invertebrates like beetle grubs and things too, but really like slugs in particular. And in terms of habitat, they're not particularly they don't have a very strong preference. They'll be found in forests or in fields or in rock barrens, but they need to have some way to escape from dry conditions themselves. And also there has to be some source of moisture in order for their food to have some moisture, because obviously slugs don't like drying out either. Now they have keeled scales, and this is one of the major reasons why that Snake ID 101 is very important. They have keeled scales. After that, their appearance can vary quite a bit. They have a gray phase, which is the most common one in the district. They also have a brown phase. And their species name, Occipito maculata, refers to these three little spots up here on the nape of their neck. Sometimes these are bright yellowy creamy color, and sometimes these are big, and sometimes they fuse together and they look like a collar. And then these get called ringneck snakes by people who think that it has a ring around its neck, so it must be a ringneck snake, but they didn't look at the scales. An awful lot of the reports of ringneck snake in our area and throughout Ontario actually turn out to be red-bellied snakes that people didn't see from below. Now, the reason they're called red-bellied snakes is because if you take a snake like this exact one here and you flip it over, it looks like that. They have this bright red color, and presumably they can flash this at predators to trick the predator into thinking that they're poisonous or something. I haven't really experienced that as a defensive display. I've only read about it. And this particular snake is like this because I took this snake and I turned it upside down, and it was only 6 degrees. So it was too cold to move otherwise. And it just sort of sat like that, which was really convenient for a cool photo. But they can have this is sort of a salmony orange. They can be a brighter red as well. And they can also be kind of a pale color on occasion, which can be confusing. Now here's a brown phase, the same species. This one's so brown you can't even see the little pinstripes. But the pinstripes are one of the important things to note in the appearance there. And then there's a brighter red. There's a much nicer red in a belly there. And some brighter collar blotches too. So if you see these were a little bit bigger and joined together, it would actually look like he had a ring on his neck. So you can see how that mistaken ID happens. I think this is an underappreciated species. Just for a second, look at the color here. Look at the detail and the gray modeling and the way that fades into the red there. More complex IDs, it's actually good to note that the ventral scale, the big long scale that's on the belly of the snake, the red doesn't go all the way to the edge. It stops and then it turns to gray well before the edge. Something that can come up if you have an upside down ring neck. They're actually quite attractive little snakes. They also can be quite friendly. It's not uncommon to find more than one together. This is 2. You can figure out where the ends are. Right? The tails are easy to see. The second head might be hard to find. But they're a pretty neat little species, and they're found in most of the green space in our area, or at least in parts of it. So here's that map from 1981, and here it is with our modern records. Now you can see a lot of that space got filled in there because it's a small species, it's a cryptic species in a lot of respects, and just in general, the small species of snakes, we don't have a ton of information on their status or their distribution in larger contexts, and most of them haven't even been assessed for whether they're at-risk species or whether they're declining. I think it'd be reasonable to say that in the Ottawa district, the red-bellied snake is secure in local areas, but it has some challenges. It comes out on roads in the fall a lot and bike paths, and that's often a fatal decision because it lies across gravel and pavement. But again, a lot of this large area that was filled in with more recent records is east of the Rideau. This whole quadrant here of the district was almost empty, and it's actually present in much of that area. Hadn't been seen before. Before we had the modern era and digital photos and more people able to contribute, and also some more targeted searching that's happened recently. So let's go to that species I mentioned that's easily confused. The northern ringneck snake is rare in our area. is got very localized populations. It has secretive behavior, so it's rarely seen. Um, it's a bit bigger than ringneck as an adult, but not a big species at all. If you get one, there's occasional reports of one that is 60 centimeters or 2 feet long, and that's a big ringneck, to be sure. Now, this one's interesting. The ringneck snake is a wide-ranging species with a lot of regional subspecies, like a lot of these are. But our local subspecies specializes in eating a specific species of salamander, the eastern redback salamander, which is normally an abundant species. In the Ottawa district, it isn't. And it will eat worms, slugs, the soft-bodied invertebrates, and apparently small frogs have been recorded as prey. But 80 to 90% of its diet in most studies is the eastern red-backed salamander. Because of that, it's generally only found in and around moist forest. It does like edges or rock barrens in forest where it can bask and warm up and then go hunt the salamanders in the cool, moist areas. But it's always associated with habitat that can harbor that prey. Now, here's where that scale thing comes in. Smooth scales, not keeled. So if you have that ring on the neck, ringneck would seem like a logical conclusion, but check the scales. If they're smooth and glossy, it's a ringneck. If they're keeled, you've probably got a red-bellied snake with weird collar patterns. They've also got, notice that sort of squared off nose there. They're very pretty in person. This is its food, or its preferred food. This is an eastern redback salamander, the typical form. In much of our area, the other form of this salamander, the leadback phase of the redback salamander, is the only one you find. There's some areas where you find both together, which is more normal in the general sense, but a lot of our area has only leadbacks for one reason or another. So if these are around, it's possible that ringnecks are around, but you can see thousands of these before you see a ringneck. But you know, if you do, they're quite handsome. Sort of here's one in context. There was a rock in this cavity, and I lifted it out, and there was a ringneck underneath, and that's just how it was sitting. Just to go look at your photo of the snake and see, oh, I was in poison ivy. Great. Like a lot of the small snakes, the babies are very, very tiny. The red-bellied snake gives birth to live young, believe it or not. This species lays eggs, but the babies are very small, very small. Yeah, and those aren't my hands. Those are much smaller hands than mine. Yeah, very nice snake. So here's our known distribution 40 years ago. And the Gatineau Park locations, these two are probably still valid. These do not exist anymore. It's not there. But we did add some. The first picture was a snake that I found in 2013. And at that point, it hadn't been seen in the district for decades. Since then, we've been able to find a few other locations as well, but it's very, very localized. A couple of spots in the west end of Ottawa, a couple more locations found on the Quebec side where there's more extensive forest remaining. And one interesting location east of the city, outside the municipal boundary, in a large block of forest that someone conveniently put on iNaturalist for the rest of us to see. So it's an intriguing species because it lives underground, it hunts these salamanders, it comes out at night or in rain, and on a good day it's hard to find. But being localized and rare seems to be the way it goes. Now, let's change size. The northern water snake, it's probably the largest snake that you're going to see in the Ottawa district, but it depends on where you go. In our area, this snake is it's uncommon, and its populations are localized. Similar to the way the ringneck is localized, but at least this one's a little more conspicuous. If you're in the right place, it's a little easier to see. They get quite big. It's normal for them to be in the range of a meter long or 3 feet as adults. And they're quite heavy bodied. They look robust. And because we're not used to seeing truly large snakes here, people think they have some kind of monster snake when they see one if they're not used to it. They live in and around water. Their name is not a lie. They hunt in the water primarily. So they hunt fish that they catch in the water and they drag to shore and they swallow on land, or frogs that they catch along the edge of the water. Same thing. And so their habitat is larger bodies of water generally, or along the shores of them, lakes, rivers, marshes. They like beaver ponds. But a key thing here is that they need upland areas to hibernate. They need to move away from the water and gain elevation and have somewhere where this large, heavy-bodied snake can get down below the frost line far enough that it doesn't freeze in the winter, but that gets it down to a point where it's not going to get flooded out by the water table at the same time. And that may be the restricting factor for its distribution in our area. Now, another important point here, keeled scales can help distinguish this from some of its, I wouldn't call them lookalikes, but if you're unfamiliar with snakes, you might not know. A lot of them are very dark and they lose their pattern as adults, like this one kind of does. If you saw this from above, you wouldn't really see any pattern. Here's one basking in a wetland, showing its pattern a little bit better. They have a banded pattern, but they get confused a lot with snakes that have a blotched pattern. Now, blotched and banded aren't the same thing. You see at the front of the snake, the bands are complete and they wrap around the snake completely. Further back on the snake, you often get this broken band effect where there's a blotch and then it's sort of a stagger and then it continues down the side. But it's with a bit of practice, you can see banding and not blotching. And blotching will be in the next species. When they're young, this is a shy young one, that pattern is much brighter and more conspicuous. So here we've got bands, and here's maybe where some of that confusion comes from too. The bands are broken here, and further back here, the bands are broken and separated. So on young snakes that look like this can be some of the most confusing to ID in Ontario and in our region because, you know, that banded blotching the distinction is breaking down and the patterns are so much more than what you're used to seeing. Now, here's a young one again that's less shy. This one bit me like 7 times when I picked it up, and then I got my wife to hold it so I could take a photo, and it was so nice and calm and gentle. And so I don't know what I did wrong. It's in here so that I can show you the belly pattern a little bit. It's very intricate. There's a lot going on. If you ever see the belly of these, and all of these little spots that you can see here are actually a half moon crescent shape kind of thing. They're quite pretty. They have a reputation for being aggressive, which isn't fair. I would say that they are more apt to be defensive. If you pick them up, they generally do try to bite, and they do try to bite a lot. But the easy way to avoid being bitten is just to not pick them up. And that's the exact same advice that I give people about chipmunks. So people, you know, complain about the snake being aggressive because, you know, they grabbed it and they're 100 times its size and it got scared and angry. But, you know, if you do that to a squirrel, it's going to hurt you more. So there's that. I suggest if you see these, just let them be there and they're going to carry on and they won't bother you if you don't bother them. They're not venomous, worth emphasizing that. Some people call them water moccasins, which is not a species that we have in this area. Yeah, they are not venomous. They just like to catch fish, just like a lot of people. Their face too, I should mention, their face looks kind of funny sometimes. I think it's the word the kids are saying. They look kind of derpy. sometimes. I find they look a little bit squished in the face. Their eyes are a bit sort of set forward and upward, more so than some of the other species, because they spend time in the water and under the water line looking up at the fish and the frogs as they're ambushing, and also to watch for aerial predators like osprey and kingfishers and things that might catch them. Uh, but they look a little different in the facial structure. Now here's the map, 40-year-old map, and here are updates. So here we found it's more widespread in these watersheds on the Quebec side, not really a surprise over there. And it's also found, it's down in Marlborough Forest, it's in Stony Swamp, away from the Ottawa River Valley. Notice that the east side of the circle here, it's absent, or apparently absent. It's not in so obvious wetland complexes that one would think would have it, like Greens Creek and Petrie Island. There's no conclusive records from there. It's on the Quebec side, and then it drops off there too. And it's a bit curious as to why that might be. I have a working theory that if it was an inhabitant of this section of the Ottawa River, there's an escarpment that runs along it that would probably have been a pretty good hibernation site. But today, there's a big highway, 174, in between that escarpment and the river. So any long distance movement, seasonal movement, would mean that the snakes are encountering cars. And that happens a lot. Again, that's not usually good for populations, and they decline and disappear. But outside of the river valley, west of here in Ontario, every beaver pond and river and lake has water snakes, and east of here, nothing, as far as we know. Still a mystery about why that is. Now here's a look-alike. Hopefully it's not on yours. The zoom bar is covering. Hold on a second. There we go. Now I can see my own screen. The milk snake, another uncommon species in our area, and one that I get a lot of questions about. I think most of the what kind of snake is this kind of ID questions that I've ever had actually end up being milk snake, because people are so not used to seeing these. They are not common anywhere, but they are still widespread in much of the district, although they're secretive. It's warm enough, they are nocturnal, so you're less likely to bump into them. And even when it's not warm enough, they like to stay hidden. They stay underground in rodent burrows or under rocks or logs or boards or things, and just really good at staying out of sight. They typically are a bit bigger than the garter snake, but not that much bigger. I think people familiar with snakes, I think the general conception of a milk snake, an eastern milk snake, is a bigger than a garter snake kind of snake, but it's not really, which I'll show you. They're a handy snake to have around, though. As adults, they largely eat they largely eat mice and other types of rodents. They're very efficient at it too. The kick here is that as juveniles, not little babies, but as juveniles, when they're in the 30 centimeter range, a substantial portion of their diet is actually other snakes. So for these to persist in a green space, there has to be enough room for enough of them to be in the population. They have to be able to stay hidden from whatever the human uses are in that area. And there also have to be other snakes present so that the young snakes, as they grow up, have that sort of teenage food source of eating little garter snakes and little red-bellied snakes before they get big enough to transition to be the mouse eating machines that they become. They prefer open habitats, or it seems that they do, or it may just be that they're easier to find in those habitats. They certainly inhabit forests very readily, and their original Ontario name was hardwood rattler. In the older literature in Ontario, they were called hardwood rattlers because they're found in deciduous forests, and they rattle their tail. They don't have a rattle on their tail, but they vibrate their tail in the leaves. A lot of snakes do this and make a bit of noise with it. It's probably mimicry. Now, Lamprepeltis, their genus name, means shiny shield. So that might be a clue that they have smooth scales. Triangulum is a reference to this Y-shaped mark or triangle mark on their head, which is usually cited as a diagnostic feature, but sometimes it doesn't look like that. So grain of salt. But anyway, let's look at some milk snakes. Something, here we go. Here's a typical looking younger milk snake. Not a juvenile, but not a huge one. Still some vibrant colors. They have this lighter background. It can be this silver or gray or light brown, and then these reddish or darker brown blotches with black outlines. And this mark on the head is usually described as a Y, certainly three-sided in some respect. You know, when you generally milk snakes, you'll see smaller ones more often than larger ones. This is not a good picture. This milk snake is similar in size to the last one. I just wanted to show, if you look at the top corner, it was under a board with a garter snake. And the garter snake was maybe the same length, maybe shorter, but kind of more chubby, more robust. So adult milk snakes do get bigger than garter snakes and can be of substantial size. But before that, milk snakes are long and slender for a lot of their lives. Here's a juvenile found last year, new location for the species at a site in Orleans that unfortunately is probably going to be a development sooner rather than later. And here's a shot where you have to be lucky, where you lift up a piece of wood and there's two hanging out and they just don't move. And you can take a cool picture like that. This was fun. These are some larger adults, and as they age, they sort of fade down from those vibrant colors they have when they're young. And this is their typical adult appearance here. So here's the range 40 years ago, and here it is with their updates. So what's interesting is we know it's persisting around the city quite well in a lot of green spaces. It's found in a couple of urban sites, which probably shouldn't be surprising because it does the same thing in Toronto and in river valleys there. It's found in most of the major connected green spaces there. And then occasionally one will wander into a backyard and someone thinks it's a cobra or something because they've never seen one before and they freak out. And so it's in a couple of areas in central Ottawa. They are still at Mud Lake, believe it or not, but very rarely actually making it in front of a camera there. And then they're in green space in the West End, they're in Stony Swamp, they're in Greens Creek, they're at that site in Orleans I mentioned, and then they're throughout Gatineau Park as well. East of Ottawa, there's some reports, some anecdotal accounts, but nothing confirmed yet. I suspect that with some more work, we might find that absence east of Ottawa is false. It's a false absence, but not there yet. So let's move on to this little snake here. This is a tough one to see for more than one reason. It's rare in our area, it's local in our area, and it's probably declining. The smooth green snake is a very easy snake to ID. It's smooth, which means smooth scales, and it's green. And that's all you really need to know. In this part of the world, there's not a lot of green snakes. You can't really get confused here. Don't do this in South America, but up here, it's green, it's this one. Not a big species, generally, and it's an insectivore. It's a true insectivore. A lot of the other species, you know, if they're smaller, they're eating slugs and worms, and then when they're bigger, they're eating some kind of vertebrate, a mouse or frog or fish. You know, they grow up into larger prey. This species eats insects, just insects. So that's beetle larvae. They really like crickets and grasshoppers when they're in season. Um, uh, Sort of a different kind of a diet. They like generally open and semi-open areas, so meadows, openings in forests, rock barrens, places where it gets hot and bright, and there's a lot of green vegetation, which helps them out. And Sort of interesting factoid there: if this has died and died recently, it will turn blue. So they get in southwestern Ontario false reports of blue racers sometimes when someone finds a dead smooth green snake. But they are likely declining in the province and in our area. This is an old photo print that I like to show when I'm talking about the species, because this is me holding a snake in 2001. And that was the last time I saw a smooth green snake until 2019 when I found this one. So just for a second, let's just say digital photography. Look at that photo quality and then look at that photo quality. Wow, technology is good. But I didn't see one of these for 18 years. And I specifically go outside looking for snakes on purpose, which most people don't do. So that's something. I used to see these regularly in the 1990s. You just every so often you'd come across one. Inevitably, there's a smooth green snake in wherever you happen to be, and that sort of gradually stopped happening. And that's just my own anecdotal account, but a lot of people have similar experiences. The thinking is because these are insectivorous snakes, that apparent decline parallels a known decline in insect populations and in insectivorous birds from the 90s to now, where populations of things like shrikes, bobolinks, meadowlarks, swallows have all kind of crashed. In the mid 90s, there were lots, and today there's much fewer, and many of those birds I named are now species at risk. Unfortunately, this snake, like all of our small snakes, hasn't been properly assessed as whether or not it's a species at risk. So if it is, it doesn't have any official status, but it could be related to that insect decline. It could be related to those systemic insecticides you might have heard. Neonicotinoid pesticides may be something that is affecting this species because it's known to be affecting now those insectivorous birds. So sort of DDT number 2 could be part of the reason for that. Certainly habitat loss and further habitat fragmentation is not helping things with any of the species, including this one. Now, this is dull. This isn't the normal color. This is a gravid female that was in ecdysis, or trying to shed her skin, preparing to shed her skin. So she's gotten a bit dull in color, and a few days after this, see where she's sitting here under this rock, it's actually very moist as well. You can see it's muddy. So a few days after this photo, she probably shed her skin and ended up looking bright and green like this, I promise, unaltered photo of how ridiculously cool green they are. Ophiodrys, their genus name, means forest snake, and vernalis means spring-like, a reference to the vibrant green that they are. So this was my second sighting of 2019, so I was happy to get 2 while breaking that long dry spell for me. But they are definitely tough to turn up. This is their recorded distribution 40 years ago. This is what we got now. So they're still on in and around Gatineau Park. We found them in the Carp Hills and in Marlborough Forest. They might still be in the Shirley's Bay area if you're looking vigilantly. But some of these haven't turned up recently. Not that one of the things that's difficult with assessing the species is because of its color. It's hard to know, is it really gone, or am I just not seeing a green thing in a bunch of green? It's a challenge. And then that blue dot, Now this is interesting for me. The blue dot is near Russell on the east side, and it's sort of breaking the spell of no records east of Ottawa. And it's a very reliable verbal report of the snake's continued presence in an area in the 1980s. And that, because the snake is hard to ID wrong, um, reliable verbal reports need to be taken very seriously with this. And so we have a very good account that it was in the Russell area, at least back then. So something to keep an eye out for. Hopefully there's more of it than we think, but unfortunately, it may have disappeared from a lot of the rest of this. So I had intended to count those species as we went through it, but I forgot. That was 7 so far. We had the garter snake, the ribbon snake, the red-bellied snake, the water snake, the milk snake, the ringneck snake, and the smooth green snake. Not in that order. That's 7. Those are the 7 we know about for sure. So now let's talk about the maybes. Now the rat snake. Now you may have heard gray rat snake, you may have heard black rat snake. I'm just calling it the rat snake because the taxonomy here is so up and down and sideways and probably going to change again. So this large species may or may not be one species or another. It was called the black rat snake for a long time because like a lot of the other species, it was divided into these subspecies based on color forms that are geographically discrete. A study that's now 22 years old came out and used some interesting DNA methodology and sort of split it into 3 species that didn't sort of take into account those color forms, and they dismissed the subspecies as invalid. And so that taxonomy got adopted by most of the agencies that follow this one organization's sort of official list. But it's sort of been challenged, and some recent publications, not regional, but in other regions that involve the species, have actually dismissed that and effectively reverted the taxonomy. And the reason is if you are interested in natural history, you know that species names change sometimes, and people get flustered and frustrated about it. And eventually, you're going to hear about mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA. And this study that is controversial reclassified the snake based on mitochondrial DNA, not nuclear DNA. And mitochondrial DNA is only passed down by the mother. There's no contribution from the father, so it's not possible to measure hybridization or intergradation in some areas. And it's a very long story and could be a whole talk all by itself. But let's just say it's part of this rat snake complex to keep it simple. Now, the thing about this is it may be found in the extreme southwestern corner of the Ottawa district. If it is, it's definitely a rare species. The adult size of the species is much larger than any other species we have. When it gets to be adult size, it can be a meter or 2 meters long, so 3 to 6 feet as an adult. It's not uncommon for there to be adult females that are 6 feet long. The record length is just over 8 feet. It's 250 something centimeters. So it's in a lot of literature, it will be called the largest snake in Canada. But technically, the largest snake in Canada is actually the bull snake found in Western Canada because of some other things. But I'm digressing. So this snake, as its name might suggest, it eats rodents. Not really rats, because rats aren't a native species. Oh, I mean, if there's rats around, I'm sure it'll dine on rats. But we're usually talking about mice and the bigger ones, chipmunks. And voles. But also at certain times of the year, it also eats young birds and eggs. So in June, you might see this going up a tree looking for a nest to raid. And actually find a lot of rat snakes by following angry bird calls at that time of year. So its habitat is upland forests and openings in those forests. Some areas it likes, it'll move into fields and things as well. It's not too particular, but it's generally an upland species, not a wetland species. And its scales are weakly keeled. So they might look smooth until you look really closely, and then there is kind of a faint keel. That's important because the most common source of confusion here is a water snake, a dark water snake. Water snakes have heavily keeled scales. So if you have something and you're not sure if it's banded or blotched, the scale keels will help you separate water and milk snake. But if you've got a dark snake and you think, oh, is this a black rat snake? Well, if it's got really heavily keeled scales, a really rough appearance to the scales, you're probably dealing with a large adult water snake and not a small adult rat snake. I'll bring up the photos here so you can see what I'm talking about. So the reason we think it's in the area is because, again, OFNC member and CWF herpetologist David Seaburn found and documented a snake that was unfortunately killed on the road while he was doing some turtle surveys, which is something he does, and it's extremely valuable to scientific record to document all of these things. And he put this one up on iNaturalist from the Marlborough Forest area, let's say. And it is definitely a rat snake. There's no doubt about its ID. The reason it's maybe is because there's a known population of these, basically southwest of here, south of Smiths Falls and Perth, and then sort of between Brockville and Kingston. There's a pocket in the Frontenac Arch where the rat snake is known to be present, and it's been known to be present there for a long time, but it seems to have a pretty solid boundary, certainly on the northern side. You know, it's been reported before north of there, and it always turns out to be something different. So the question is it actually from Marlborough Forest, or did it, say, climb onto a vehicle that was down that way and then kind of kamikaze its way off while that vehicle is driving down a road through Marlborough Forest? It's a possibility. Now, obviously, finding one of these is, if they're present there naturally, they're clearly rare, and finding one is unlikely. Having one climb onto a vehicle and then fall off, I mean, they are known to hitchhike. In the US, where the species is more common, there's some clear evidence of hitchhiking every so often, especially where in parts of Florida, the species is orange. And if it climbs on a truck and then climbs off a truck 1,000 miles to the west of that, well, okay, you know what happened. It rode a truck and then crawled off, and then that's why someone found an orange snake in Texas or something. So it's been known to happen. I've seen some videos on YouTube where people have like a rat snake crawling on the hood of their vehicle, and they're kind of freaking out that there's a snake on their car, and it's a rat snake, and it just was looking for somewhere warm, and then they started driving and it came out. So it is something that can happen. But again, for that to happen and then for it to be found and documented is also an unlikely event. So it would be good to find another one to confirm that it's from there, to rule out that it wasn't just an errant hitchhiker. But it's not very far from the known population. That's definitely a rat snake, and it's feasible. As long as it has somewhere where it can hibernate, a hibernaculum large enough to accommodate an adult snake in Marlborough somewhere, it is feasible. So more information needed, but certainly it's been recorded in the district. Whether or not it's one of our snakes, be good to get a little more research. If you do happen to be out that way, or anywhere really, and you see a snake up in a tree like this, might be a rat snake. They like to climb trees in the summertime. They like to hide in tree hollows. This is one of those 6-foot adult females. spreading herself out on a branch as the sun is coming over to that part of the trees to bask. She's just stretching out there. Get a nice view of the belly pattern. You see, they look good. This one is very dark. This individual has gone very dark. You see where black rat snake comes from as a name. Other individuals maintain their pattern, and they can see these blotches more. Now I don't know if you can see this. There's a upset rose-breasted grosbeak here, and there's a rat snake here, the head and the rest of it, and it just finished eating this bird's eggs. So it was happy and made a lot of noise, which is why I was able to see the snake. Here's another one that's gotten very dark. Did I include a picture with the blotches? I thought I did. Nope, I didn't. That's too bad. So when they're born, they are actually a light kind of gray or brown color, and they have a lot of blotches, and they fade as they age sometimes. And sometimes, well, I guess on the record I showed you with Dave, you could still see those blotches visible. It depends on the individual snake, how much you can see of that pattern when they're an adult. Usually they get very dark like this one, but sometimes they keep those blotches. So that can affect what you think you're dealing with. But if you look closely at these scales, again, you would see a keel, but from this distance, they actually look like they're smooth. So anyway, they're pretty tame in terms of their behavior. They're not, you know, if you lift a water snake off a road down, it's going to get mad at you and bite you and poop at you and everything. It won't probably hurt you at all, maybe. But these are a species at risk. These are considered threatened, or the nearest population to us that's confirmed is considered a threatened species. And in southwestern Ontario, the population there is considered endangered. So if you do see one of these, you can't pick it up unless you're taking it out of harm's way, like off a road. If it's just minding its own business, it's like legally imperative that you also mind your own business and don't catch it for no reason. Just take a photo and report it. Now, there might be another species that is maybe a number 8 if the rat snake isn't that, and it's the Decay's brown snake. It's a close relative of the red-bellied snake. This is a screen grab from the map, the Ontario Nature Reptile Atlas. And so those two dots up here by Arn Prior there in Lanark County, they're kind of an errant distribution. And I get reports of these in the Ottawa districts fairly frequently. And inevitably they turn out to be red-bellied snakes, not Decay's brown snakes. But it's a little bit weird that they're absent from our area, because here's the wider distribution. In most of their range, they're a widespread snake. They're a common snake. They're probably the most common snake in the GTA, probably more common than the garter snake there. And they're found farther north than Ottawa. They're found up around North Bay. They're found this far east. They're found in Algonquin Park, that's for sure. And they're found around Montreal, on the islands around Montreal. Now, apparently, based on the knowledge we have from Quebec, they're only found on those islands and not on any of the mainland areas around that, although they are found throughout New York State, right up to the southern border of Quebec. So that absence there in Eastern Ontario is a bit weird, but they are absent from quality habitat in this region here, where those other species with that same weird not in Eastern Ontario pattern, they're still present. They're still present here. So these two records and the odd reports are why I'm mentioning it, because maybe it's coming into West Ottawa. It's hard to rule out without some more detailed surveys. Now here's a picture. I'm not the one holding this, I'm just taking the photo. And every time I look at this photo, all I see is the fingernails. But this is, I need better photos of this. I used to see these all the time when I grew up in Kingston, but that was before digital photography. And so I don't have a lot of good photos of this one to share. it's similar to a red-bellied snake. The head pattern's different. It has this broad, pale dorsal stripe, usually with checkers staggered along the outside of it. And it doesn't have a bright red belly. It has a pale colored belly and sometimes there's little dots along the side. It's a small snake, and one of its specialties is catching snails and twisting them out of their shell to eat them. Again, a common snake, tolerant of urban environments, just stops existing in Ontario at some point, and apparently isn't in our area, but gets reported an awful lot. And you know, wouldn't surprise me if it slipped into the west end of the circle there one day with some more information. I've been talking a lot about distribution. That's because obviously to protect an animal, to conserve an animal, or to conserve habitat, you need to know what lives in that habitat. And a lot of our knowledge of reptile and amphibian distribution is incomplete even today. The Conservation Committee of the OFNC has got some ongoing projects to sort of better flesh out our understanding of the distribution and status of all reptiles and amphibians in our area. And one of the reasons for that is weird distribution maps like this. This is the water snakes distribution in the Ontario Reptile and Amphibian Atlas. So this doesn't include New York or Quebec data, but see how it just kind of stops and then it's absent? Like there's like a vertical wall. Like there's no consistent reason for that. They are found south of the St. Lawrence there, and this species is found in the Montreal area and farther north in Quebec. So it's not climatic. It could be insufficient hibernation features, or it could be that it was extirpated historically because of the extensive land clearing and agriculture there in Eastern Ontario. But other species have the same pattern. Here's the milk snake, absent from Eastern Ontario. Here's the smooth green snake, pretty much absent from Eastern Ontario. That Russell report be right there, right in the middle of this. So it could be historic habitat loss. It could be lack of data though. And so with some common species, what we've been able to do is go to areas that don't have any reports, similar to these uncommon and harder to find species, and turn up those common species very, very easily with minimal search effort, which is suggesting that a lack of historic search effort or lack of data is actually responsible for those absences rather than a true physical absence of the species. So it's possible that some of these, with some more work in some of the remnant natural areas, we can turn them up as well, and maybe sort of to me, it would make more sense that they either are there or that they used to be there, rather than that there's some weird reason why no reptiles like to live in this part of the world when they live east, west, north, and south of it. Like the smooth green snake is found on all sides of this area, but not in it. I don't know. It's strange, and it's a mystery we're trying to solve. So something you can do is, if you get photos of snakes that you see on your adventures in the warmer times of year, put them on iNaturalist and add them to this project. This is the OFNC's project without a convenient or short or catchy name, the Reptiles and Amphibians of Ottawa and Eastern Ontario. You add them to this, we'll be able to see. This is an old screen grab. There's a lot of participants and a lot of records at this point. This is like brand new when I made it. But it's more than 22 now. But please report your sightings. It's really helpful. And because of people reporting their casual observations or their deliberate hard-won searches on iNaturalist, all of it, it's all very helpful, and it's helped us find additional records of a number of rare and cryptic species in the area that we wouldn't have known about otherwise. So there's a more blotchy rat snake. Okay, with that, does anyone have any questions? And I guess I will read the chat because I can't hear any. Okay. Are there water snakes at Mud Lake? Going back to the beginning here. Yes, there are water snakes at Mud Lake. Mud Lake is the easternmost location in the present day that I know of that consistently has water snakes present. The best time to see water snakes at Mud Lake is in the spring or fall and climb up on the ridge, the ridge on the north side of Castles. They hibernate in there. And if you walk along there and look carefully on the sides, you might see one out basking, or you might frighten one away and you'll see it fleeing. Occasionally you can see them basking on the shoreline or hunting, but it's not too common there to see them out like that. But the spring or fall on the ridge, it's pretty easy to see them. Go on a good sunny day in those seasons. See, Jonathan says he observed a large blackish snake in Orleans 15 years ago. That's interesting. In Orleans, wonder what that was. Sometimes our own observations from the past, whether we were young or not, but just from some time ago, it'd be nice to have photos of some of those recollections. I found queen snakes when I was 10 years old in a place where they aren't actually officially documented, but I don't have a photo because I was 10 years old and cameras used film. So that would have been nice. Fitzroy Harbor Provincial Park, a large snake on an island. Yes, that is most likely a water snake, given the location and the habitat. They are definitely quite common in that area. And actually, I should say, if you want to see water snakes, never mind Mud Lake, you can see them there. The best place to see water snakes is Morris Island Conservation Area, causeway. Just walk on that on a sunny, warm day and watch the water on both sides, and they might be lying there basking or swimming around hunting. It's an amazing place to observe them. Let's see. 2 water snakes in Frontenac Provincial Park. Yes, so once you get down southwest of here into the Frontenac Arch, water snakes are kind of ubiquitous. Another reason why their absence is a bit odd. So like they're present in Stony Swamp, in beaver ponds. They're not common. That could be because Stony Swamp's fragmented and there's lots of people, and not all people are nice to snakes, but they're there as you'd expect them to be in that habitat. But if you go to that similar habitat on the east side of Ottawa on the Greenbelt, you can't find them, which is, it's strange. It's like the climate doesn't change that much. The habitat is similar, the summer habitat at least. So, okay. Can I look at this after? Let me stop sharing my screen. I can see people's faces here. All right. Susan Boyd sent me a link to look at. I will look at that after. And that link is not found. So I will try that again afterwards. Hold on. I am losing the Zoom window. Okay. Can any other snakes climb trees? Do we have melanistic snakes such as a garter? Oh, yes, that's a great question. That's great. 2 questions. Yes, other snakes do climb trees. So the rat snake is known to be a particularly arboreal species in its habits, and it will climb really high, really regularly. But other snakes can and do climb. And sometimes it's in the springtime, if they get flooded out of their hibernation sites, they'll climb up just to get out of the wet and stay dry. Water snakes will occasionally climb for that reason. Smooth green snakes, it's not often seen because they're not often seen, but they climb, they're known to climb readily up to about 2 meters in height in shrubs while they're hunting insects. So if you're looking for smooth green snakes in a shrubby area in a field, don't just look on the ground, look up into the shrubs and things as well for any little green ropey things. So yeah, they can. Garters and ribbon snakes will climb in low shrubs, especially in the vicinity of wetlands, again, when they're hunting. All of them can, but again, like water snakes, they're big, heavy-bodied, clunky snakes, and they're designed for swimming. So for some of them, it's awkward. You think of like a young, spry kid that climbs trees all the time versus maybe a an adult that used to climb trees all the time as a kid, but now tries to climb a tree for the first time in 20 years, it's not going to go as well. Sort of the water snake in this case. It's so they do at times, and then melanistic snakes. So yeah, garters are occasionally melanistic. It's quite common to find melanistic garter snakes in the peninsulas and islands around Lake Erie in southwestern Ontario. All of those peninsulas and the western Lake Erie archipelago, a significant proportion of the garter population there is melanistic. And that is believed to be, melanism is just, it's a genetic variation. It's the same as what's in our eastern gray squirrel in our area, how most of the squirrels in Ottawa are actually black. They're melanistic and they're sort of favorably selected. They're at the northern end of that species range. And because it's so cold here, being black, physically black, is a benefit to them because they retain heat. And for the same reason, these snakes on peninsulas and islands in the cool spring that's moderated by the lake water and the lake temperatures, it's believed to be an advantage, which is why that mutation is more common there. You can also find melanistic garters very regularly on the Toronto Islands. In our area, it wouldn't be a common thing. It would be a rare thing, but it's possible. Having said that, a melanistic garter snake is going to be physically different than something like a rat snake. And a rat snake the size of a garter snake wouldn't be black. Similar, like I mentioned how a dead smooth green snake is blue, and we don't have racers in our area. The blue racer of southwestern Ontario, when it's the same size as a green snake, it has a blotchy pattern, a blotchy juvenile pattern. Same with the rat snake. When it's the same size as what a melanistic garter snake would be, it would have a blotchy juvenile pattern. It wouldn't look black. So there can be some confusion from that, but there's other ways to sort of figure out the mystery there. Susan asked, does anyone know what the colors signify? I'm not sure what snake I was talking about when that was asked. Okay, how do I approach snakes? That's an experience and caution. And it's always helpful when you see the snake first. If the snake sees you first, they do try to slither away because they think you're a predator and they don't want to be food. That's a whole other thing. When we can do field trips, maybe you'll do something fun. It's there's different techniques for different species to get close to them. Garters, though, quickly, if you see a garter snake on a path and you see it and it sees you at about the same time, and you get that a snake kind of jolt reaction, don't chase it. Just watch it. If you don't chase it and you just watch where it goes for a few seconds, usually they stop. And when they stop, they will look at you. And when that happens, you can move very slowly and carefully without getting too close, or don't go directly at it, but you can move around and kind of wiggle your way closer to get good photos. It's pretty reliable with garter snakes. And that'd be the best place to start if you want to see snakes better, because you'll see more garter snakes than anything else. And if you can get good at sort of not scaring away the garter snake, because as soon as you don't chase it, it gets curious as to why is that predator not trying to eat me? What is it? And you can use that. It's pretty good with those. Okay, Eric asks, why does legislation call it eastern ribbon snake? That's taxonomically a different. Okay, so sometimes the people who have come up with the official name lists for the reptiles and amphibians have done some confusing things. So our subspecies of ribbon snake is the northern ribbon snake, so the Thamnophis soreus septentrionalis. There is another subspecies, the nominate subspecies is called the eastern ribbon snake, but the collective species is also called the eastern ribbon snake, and nobody has changed one of the names yet. So there's an eastern and a western ribbon snake at the species level, and then the eastern ribbon snake, the species, breaks down into 4 subspecies, and one of them is called eastern as well, just to be confusing. So it's not wrong to call ours the eastern. Um, it's you're just being more specific, subspecific, if you're calling it the northern. So when legislation is making the species protected at the species level, it's also correct to use eastern, and that's why it's good to know the Latin names as well as the things. Now, oh, I've got some links here sent to me. I don't know if I can get these. Let's see. Jonathan, the large blackish snake on the shore of Lake Beauchamp, that may well have been a water snake. They're known from that lake. And those are the, in the Ottawa Valley, strictly speaking, those are the easternmost ones until you get to close to Montreal. Again, for reasons we don't entirely understand. Okay, ethically searching for snakes. Yeah, so let's see. Hold on a second here. Downloaded those photos. I'll have a quick little look. Okay, so yes, the who sent that one? Oh, there it is. Sorry. So Janet, your Morris Island water snake. Yep, that's a water snake. That's a cool image of one basking there with its head on a tuber from a lily pad. Probably a younger one. It's got a very strong pattern there. And unidentified snake, Frontenac Park, May 2014, from Susan. That is a rat snake. That's a nice shot. That's definitely a rat snake in that photo. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so Eric says, can you get some advice for ethically searching for snakes and some of the public issues? Yeah. So yeah, so snakes are generally they're declining. Some species are because they're super generalist, like garter snakes, they're hanging on, and red-bellied snakes with a good pocket of habitat because they're small. So within a small area, there can be lots of them, and they eat slugs, which are generally abundant. Um, they hang on better in larger parcels of habitat, but a lot of snakes are suffering from habitat loss directly. Habitat fragmentation is a serious issue. It's not as extreme as in turtles, but snakes tend to be longer lived as adults, and juvenile snake mortality is very high, and adult snake mortality is relatively low. So it's similar to those issues if you're familiar with it. So when adults get hit on roads moving between habitats or from hibernation areas to foraging areas and that sort of thing, it has impact on the population. And unlike turtles, there isn't sort of massive outpouring of love for the animals. And a lot less people will try not to hit a snake on the road versus a turtle, unfortunately. So fragmentation is a serious challenge for all snakes. On asphalt too, the way snakes move, the way their locomotion works, they generally are not able to move as quickly on asphalt. So they get slowed down, even if they're trying to boot it across the road. And they also get lured onto the road on warm nights because it's warm and everything else is cooling off, and they're trying to stay warm, and it's just a bad scene for them. And then there's some specific threats. Water snakes get directly persecuted. They're big and people are scared of them, and they're around docks and places where people are boating and fishing, and people have these mistaken ideas that they're venomous, which of course they are not, and that they're dangerous, which they are not, et cetera, et cetera. So they get directly persecuted by people, and so do some other species for different reasons. And then this is issues like with the smooth green snake where there might be some other um, threats at play there. So again, what we have left, just like any piece of nature, we have to be careful with it. We have to respect that we're not the only person in it. So in general, you want to stay on the trails in any area, and you can see snakes from trails. And it doesn't necessarily, you don't have to be the first person down a trail and um, in like several hours for there to be snakes. There may not be one lying across the path in front of you, but they may be moving around um, on the sides in the habitat, and just any habitat you're in, something that you can watch for. And then a very common way to look for snakes and some other herbs is by looking under cover objects, as we call them. So this is rocks, logs, discarded boards. Snakes sometimes like to hide under all kinds of garbage. Um, and generally, if you're doing that, again, you don't want to do anything that would seriously disturb or trash a habitat. You want to be careful, lift things carefully. And if you lift stuff up to look at the creatures underneath, whatever those creatures are, it's important that you always put the cover back how you found it, and that when you put it back, you do it carefully and that you don't crush anything. And when you have a larger animal, a vertebrate animal, generally you want to escort it out from under the cover, put the cover back, and then shoo it back underneath to its hiding place. Just in short, public issues that Eric mentions. So this sort of common hiking practice of if there's a rock baron and taking loose rocks and building stacks and towers and fake inuksuks and things like this is actually detrimental to the habitat. Cover objects are important natural features and important microhabitat for snakes, as well as a lot of other creatures that use those open habitats, especially if it's an opening in a forest. In terms of the habitat, there's way less natural opening than there is natural forest. So it's a higher sort of commodity for the wildlife. There's less of it. It's more valuable, and impacts there have are can be more significant. So it's important to leave rocks and logs and cover objects where they are naturally and not stack them all, because then they can't be sites for warming up. For in the case of snakes, they use them to warm up to digest meals. They use them to warm up when they're preparing to shed. They use them to when they're gravid, when they have young or eggs that are developing, and their prey uses it as well. All kinds of insect species use that cover. Um, the species that live in those openings, the insect species are different than the ones in the clearings. Basically, we just should let natural habitat be natural and not muck it up as much as we can. Are snakes generally out in the daytime? Depends on the snake. Garter snakes, yes. Water snakes, yes. And other snakes depends on the time of year. So milk snakes are most active in the evening and in the first half of the night. So from 6 p.m. to midnight, generally speaking. But if it has been cool, or in the spring and the fall when it's cool at nighttime, then they can be active more in the daytime. Might be a video of a water snake hunting at Morris Island on the MFNC website from Janet. Thank you. So annual and lifetime cycle. Where do they hibernate? How long and where? How long do they live? Okay. Snakes hibernate underground, basically. The key stuff is that snakes, they don't want to freeze, but they don't want to drown. So the key feature in any hibernation site, I should say, we call hibernation sites are called hibernacula. Even though snakes don't hibernate, they brumate, but we haven't called them brumacula or brumaculums or whatever it would be. That word hasn't been modified yet, which is good because it's weird. So we call it a hibernaculum or hibernacula still, but they brumate, which is to say they're still awake. They're technically still active in the winter. And some studies have documented pretty long underground movements in some snakes in the wintertime, but they're not, they're cool. So they stay cool. And because they're ectothermic and they don't burn energy to maintain body temperature, they don't need a lot of food, so they don't lose a lot of weight through the winter. They're at this cool temperature and they can move slowly around, but they don't need to eat. They don't need to hunt. And it's actually good when snakes are in the fall, they bask a lot more before they go and hibernate to fully digest the last thing they ate. Because if they don't digest at a high temperature that they need, the thing they ate can get rancid inside the digestive tract and poison them, which can be an issue at a low temperature. At any rate, they want to basically be just down somewhere where they don't freeze. And if the thing is near a water table, they need to maintain sort of this ideal space above the water table below the frost line. Um, and sometimes some species will move long distances to like a den site, like big rock crevices or something, where a lot of snakes will share that space because it's very good. And they can also hibernate individually in like the old root system of a tree or something like that. Um, it's not necessarily the case that all species go to a big, massive congregation at a den site. And some species are more likely to do that than others, but that's more a factor of what that species needs in a den site. So a rat snake at this latitude might need the site it requires for hibernation might be a more rare kind of feature that's big enough for a big snake to get down that deep and not drown in a spring with a high water table. Whereas some species can hibernate in more shallow sites or in smaller types of tunnels. The smooth green snake hibernates as an individual snake. It finds a big anthill, typically, and it burrows itself down into an anthill and it hibernates at the bottom of an ant nest. That's where they've most often been found hibernating on their own, just in some anthill. So it's a lot of detail and specificity depending on which snake we're talking about. But yeah, so then they get up in the spring. Usually mating happens around that time. Depending on whether the snake has eggs or gives birth to young, some do one, some do the other. The females carry that into the summer. They give birth / the eggs hatch. If they lay eggs, they're laying them in, say, mid-June, late June, early July. If they're carrying young, they're still carrying young. Birth / hatching happens late August, early September, typically. And then it's a rush to get your last meal, get to your hibernation site, bask, digest everything, get down for the winter before it gets really cold. And some snakes live quite a long time. We think, based on studies done in the Frontenac Arch, that rat snakes, to take the big example, are 10 years old before they even breed the first time. Further south, in southeastern US, they might be 4 years old when they breed for the first time. But up here, because everything goes more slowly, because it's interrupted for 6 months of the year with this lovely white frozen stuff outside, it takes them longer. And they can live a few decades. Probably shorter lifespans in the smaller snakes, just from having more predators and more predation. Red-bellied snakes, I think 5 to 6 years is a typical lifespan. But relatively speaking, they can be long-lived adults in general, and surprisingly long for the size of the animal. Let's see. Oh, what do the colors mean for the squares in the atlas? Okay, so that's the atlas maps use these colored squares. Red were historic sightings only in that 10 by 10 kilometer square. Green was historic and current sightings, and yellow was only current sightings. So it's just a time scale to add to the records, and it's based on the last 20 years. So something older than 20 years was labeled historic, newer than 20 years was labeled new, and current and historic, like the gold standard, we know it's been there the whole time, kind of thing. Okay, and I think I'm out of questions. All right. So thank you everyone for attending. I hope I've answered everything. Um, and if anyone wants to ask anything else, now's the time. Otherwise, again, thank you for attending, and have a good evening, and we'll see you again at another event.